Welcome to day one of our international symposium.
The Prime Minister's been very clear that Brexit means Brexit. So that's the soundbite. Brexit means Brexit.
And how would the United Kingdom emerge if the United Kingdom would remain? Or would it basically splinter into England and Wales?
Brexit is provocative of thought, not of negative action.
There would be sort of an 8 billion euro deficit in the EU's budget.
None of these issues that we as the UK and the US work on very closely together are going to go away.
I think what's happening here in MDC, not just as the biggest and one of the leading colleges in the US, is absolutely fantastic. The way that students can interact on issues like this that may not perhaps come across their radar every day.
Thank you again for our panelists for attending us here at Miami-Dade College. Let me start off the conversation on asking the question, does Brexit mean Brexit? In the words of Theresa May. We had a referendum that was just cast, and the question becomes, is that referendum binding, or should it have a follow-up referendum or a follow-up act of parliament to basically initiate Article 50 that begins the negotiations to basically have the United Kingdom exit from the European Union?
Thank you, Professor Tapia. And thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I'm an EU specialist teaching at FIU, and as such, I would leave it to our Honorable Consul to talk more about the domestic processes in Britain, right? The invocation of this famous EU Article 50. If there are any more questions you can ask me about what that really means. It's basically, right, a treaty provision in the European Union that says if a country wants to succeed, it can invoke that article, and then technically within 2 years there should be a separation, an orderly separation with the support of both parties concerned, the country that wants to exit as well as the other member states. Now, however, I think we sometimes do focus a little bit too much on this 2-year period. There's also a treaty provision in paragraph 2, I believe, that says if both parties agree to it, the 2-year period can be extended. And we've seen already that, when was the referendum? June 23rd, that the British government doesn't seem to be in a hurry to invoke that Article 50, right? There's a lot of, right now, navel-gazing going on, a lot of first sort of trying to ascertain what are the potential issues that we need to cover. The ramifications are humongous. It's trade, it's foreign policy, it's all the treaty works, it's constitutional questions, domestically as well as in the European Union. It's international geopolitics. So right now, I think we're really in sort of a phase where we still are looking at a lot of uncertainties, and I'm pretty sure nobody wants to rush the invocation of Article 50. Not the Europeans necessarily, even though they said initially they would, nor the United Kingdom.
But I think that's right, Marcus. The Prime Minister's been very clear that Brexit means Brexit. So that's the soundbite. Brexit means Brexit. The referendum itself was not legally binding. So the executive arm, the government, could decide whether they are going to act on it or not. It's been very clear from the moment the result was known and when Prime Minister David Cameron stepped down the morning after, that the government would act on it. And we obviously, as a democracy, proud democracy, would expect to act on what the people tell our government to do. So that's very clear. But as Marcus says, this is complicated. To give you an idea, the EU is the biggest single trading bloc in the world. We have been a member, the UK has been a member for over 40 years. There are over 80,000 pages of documents that make up our treaty arrangements with our European colleagues. So trying to unpick that lot, even with 2 years, is going to be quite a tall order. So we're definitely not going to rush into launching the famous Article 50, which sets the clock ticking. Article 50 is 250 words long. So as in many of the European treaties, there's a degree of interpretation you can put around it. But basically it means that the UK government has to write a letter saying we wish to leave and we're notifying you now that we're leaving. Theresa May, our Prime Minister, has been very clear, including yesterday actually at the UN General Assembly in New York, that we're not going to rush into this until we're ready. It's not going to happen this year, and we're not going to speculate when it will happen. We need to take time to work out what is going to be best for the UK, what kind of relationship is going to be best for the UK with Europe, and what's also going to be best for our European partners in dealing with the UK going forward. But there are a number of things that are clear, and one of the other soundbite I'll give you, along with Brexit means Brexit, is that the UK will remain at the heart of the EU, even if it's not in the European Union. What that means is that we are going to be looking to get the closest possible economic relationship with our European partners. We're going to be cooperating on everyday issues that really matter to all of our societies, whether that's immigration, migration, economic issues, security. Let's not forget that we have a newly empowered Russia on our eastern border who is making life very difficult for many, many people, not least in Syria, as we've seen over the last few days. The UK will be very much at the heart of that debate, making sure that our particular part of the world is very much relevant in global affairs going forward. Now, the two constitutional questions that you asked were, whether there needs to be another vote in order to launch Article 50. We don't think there does. We think this is within the gift of the government of the day to do that. So when they're ready, they will launch that process.
Well, what I find fascinating is Brexit means Brexit, but my reference for such an interpretation would be the Oxford English Dictionary, in which it does not appear yet. So we find ourselves in a very dynamic circumstance in which, if literally the British exit is indeed an initiative which will be completed within a given time or extended time, the necessary expertise to disengage is an incredible wide range of different talents. Lawyers, of course, always will have jobs, whether you engage or disengage, but also the trade negotiation, the other individuals involved in the process. It looks also from the point of view of other parties, provocative of other interesting phenomenon. The largest trading partner of Northern Ireland is Southern Ireland, in fact, and then England and so forth. Under the 1998 Easter Agreement, if I'm not mistaken, one of the options in the not too distant future with regard to the apparent unification of the entire island of Ireland is sometime possibly a referendum on that, actual vote within that agreement at a particular time. And so this Brexit is provocative of thought, not of negative action with regard to that particular relationship within the United Kingdom itself. And it also seems to be provocative of another interaction within this beautiful entity off the shore of Europe with regard to the Scottish population who appears to have exerted a particular desire to stay in the European Union. And so the magic, the Brigadoon moment may indeed be the time between how the people spoke through the referendum in June and then the instrumentation and then the implementation of what's finally agreed upon. So I think far from a time of anxiety, if you read financials, and I'm a capitalist, and factories and other basic institutions are doing fine. So our relationship basically is not going to be distorted or principally disturbed given other things in the context in which this transaction is going on in the largest market in the world and then in an increasingly interconnected, interdependent world.
What type of relationship do you believe is going to emerge between the United Kingdom and the European Union? Because prior to the referendum vote, there was a provisional agreement that many have believed would give the United Kingdom a preferred position within the European Union that has now been nullified. But what would that type of relationship look like with the European Union? Would it be within the European Free Trade Association? Would you seek membership into the single market, and in doing so, open up the United Kingdom for inflows of free labor from other member states? And also, how would this then change, as Dr. Lanigan brought up, the relationship within the United Kingdom as as in Scotland voting for independence, or the Good Friday Accords mentioned by Dr. Lenigan that would give Northern Ireland the option to vote to join with the rest of Ireland? And how would the United Kingdom emerge if the United Kingdom would remain? Or would it basically splinter into England and Wales and allow Scotland to remain within the European Union as well as Ireland?
So I'm going to talk mostly about the bilateral relationship between the UK and the European Union, and leave it then to our Honourable Consul General to answer more maybe some of the referendum-related questions internally, the fragmentation of the island. Again, it is complicated. So there's sort of the distinction of the hard Brexit, which would mean basically removing the UK from all the legislation, from the single market access that the Europeans have built up, and so on and so on. This is rather unlikely. I also believe that because it's in really nobody's interest to do so. It's not in the interest of the UK, it's not in the interest of the Europeans as well. So the question is more sort of the fine-tuning of that future relationship, because this is the first time that a country decides in a popular referendum to split apart. So we really look here into the unknown. And the question will probably much closer revolve around sort of what kind of either relationship within the EFTA, the European Free Trade Area, sorry, it gets a little bit technical, EFTA, the European Free Trade Area, to which Norway, Liechtenstein, Switzerland already belongs, or the European Economic Area, which is also related to that. Now, the question is that most of these EFTA countries also belong to the European Economic Area. That means they get access to the EU single market. They pay around half of the membership fee that a regular EU member state pays, but they also have to respect all the rules and regulations and the laws of the European Union. Now, one of the big issues in the referendum was that the United Kingdom's sovereignty was somehow, being affected by the European Union. So I think it would be hard for the government to justify that, and maybe you can say a little bit more about that. Basically, to subscribe to, in order to attain single market access, to subscribe to all the laws of the European Union, because then you have no control over immigration, right? You have to still follow the EU's laws and regulations, but you're not anymore sitting at the table where all the laws and negotiations are being made. So that is something, that fine-tuning that needs to happen. And of course, it's not only the United Kingdom that has something to lose, it's also the Europeans that have something to lose. And we were just talking earlier about this. I just came back yesterday from Germany, and the Germans, of course, as you can imagine, they were wondering, one of the first in the European Union, who pays for Brexit, right? Literally. And so there would be sort of an 8 billion euro deficit in the EU's budget of around 150 billion annually. That's quite substantial. So how is that going to be happening? What if the United Kingdom, their academic elite, they still are very much engaged in the EU's scientific and educational programs, right? So this would be also something that has to be negotiated. How will we make up for these 8 billion that are being lost? Will Germany and France have to pay even more into the EU budget, right? That means you stoke anti-EU sentiments in those countries, leading to maybe, a Frexit that the French far-right politician Marine Le Pen already wants to do, or fix it, as the Finnish just now tried to start a petition for that. Or will we have to significantly cut back the budget of the European Union? And that, of course, will also mean, less possibilities, less actions for economic prosperity and growth in a union that's already marked by a number of crises.
Marcus, I think that part of the discussion that we haven't had yet is how does Europe respond to the UK decision to leave the EU? I'll just want to step back up a stage just to explain why this is important and why it's important here in Florida. Just a bit over 40% of our exports go to the EU. About 3 million jobs depend on the EU. As far as UK-US is concerned, we each employ 1 million of each other's citizens. We're each other's biggest foreign direct investors. And here in Florida, the UK companies employ something over 40,000 Floridians. We're the biggest overseas European investor here in Florida. So what happens to the UK economy is not constrained to the UK or even to the EU, our closest neighbours and our biggest trading partners. It really has a global impact. And so the UK is going to continue to be an outward-looking trading nation. We want to reduce trade barriers. We want global trade to increase because that has benefits across the board, whether that's in terms of development for the emerging economies, whether that's in terms of economic growth and jobs for our own economies. So our decision around our relationship with the EU, although a lot of it is based on trade and around the economies, that's not the only thing. There is this balance between whether we trade free access to the European market with free movement of European citizens in and out of the UK. And this was one of the critical parts of the referendum, where the British people said through the referendum that actually they weren't comfortable with that complete freedom of movement and that we needed greater control over our own borders. Now, how we negotiate that, we don't yet know, because no one's tried to do it before. So there are lots of models out there. I mean, Marcus, you mentioned a few. There are models around migration and controlling migration, this Australian points-based system. What we do know is that it will be a British model. It won't be a different model. It won't be a Norwegian or a Swiss or whatever. It will be a British model that hopefully will be able to balance our interests in the UK with the interests of our European partners. If you have been following this, and if you have, good for you, there has been a lot of commentary about some disquiet in some voices within the EU saying, well, the Brits have got to get on with this. You mustn't delay because we don't like uncertainty. And there's been others saying that this will be a hard exit. It will be an adversarial type of negotiation with the UK. Well, the UK runs a trade deficit. In other words, we buy more than we sell to every single other European member state with the exception of Ireland. Germany alone sells 800,000 cars a year in the UK. So there is a huge amount at stake for the EU as a whole in getting this relationship right. And as you mentioned, Michael, although a lot of people look at the UK and the financial institutions, the financial sector, we're the biggest exporter of international financial services in the world, and say, well, UK is going to have to compromise to make sure its financial institutions have access to the EU market. Well, yes, there are 5,000 UK financial institutions who need that access, but there are 8,000 European financial institutions who need access to the UK market. So this isn't an equation which is just based on a one-way bet. There has to be a very sensible and sober negotiation between the parties, and the incentives to get it right on both sides are going to be very strong. We're now in a situation where we need to work out what it is that we need to be prioritizing for our citizens and how that is going to work for the best way possible for our European partners.
Sorry, may I just one sentence add on to that? And also, in order for Brexit to really occur, all the European Union institutions, as well as the EU member states, have to agree to it. So you can see here that has to result in some sort of semi-consensual manner, right? Otherwise, it simply won't be happening.
The Council General mentioned the special relationship that the UK has with the United States and here with the state of Florida. And I wanted to elaborate on that a little bit more, because the United States and the UK has had and shared a special relationship and will continue to have one with the Transatlantic Alliance. And the question becomes, would this alliance now be deepened? How do you see the United States playing a role in the negotiations? And would a preferable trade agreement with the United States or a new relationship, a stronger relationship with the United States, play a role in leverage and negotiating these agreements with the European Union?
Yeah, again, I think it's not quite as clear-cut as some of the media may want them to look like. One of the biggest issues that right now, policy issues that are on the table, is the so-called transatlantic trade and investment partnership that's planned between the United States and the European Union as a whole. Because we have about 12 trillion in trade annually. That's trade in goods and services. The UK makes up about 2.5, I believe, so only about a third of that, right? Where the UK really, to Brexit completely, that would put TTIP in question, that trade agreement. There are some Europeans on the continent that don't want TTIP to happen, to come to fruition, my country, Germany included. There are some others as well. And so they may say, well, the UK is sort of has been always, exactly because of the special transatlantic alliance, sort of the US's Trojan horse into the European Union, right? So if the UK were to leave, we would be able to maybe fashion a more socially liberal union, right? We would be able to maybe not pursue TTIP. But those voices in the European Union are sometimes also a little bit too overly optimistic, because how can you, I mean, the European Union is built on the single market, right? And if a major country were to totally break away, that major single market would be less attractive and would be weaker, and then there would be less possibilities for growth. So again, I think the interest in the interest of all, there will be, we will come to as close to a status quo as possibly.
Yeah, I mean, free trade is important to us. I mean, we if you look through the UK's history, the UK's economy has been very much built on global trade. And if you just look at, actually, if you just go to London, if you ever have the good fortune to go, and I would encourage you to, because it's a lot cheaper now than it was in June. And if you just look at the architecture, because the centre of London is quite a Victorian city, and just look at the architecture, and you'll see in the architecture all sorts of little signals about global trade, whether it's a trading ship, whether it's plants or animals or spices or herbs from around the world. You'll see it's hardwired into our buildings. So if it's in our buildings, it's absolutely in our psyche. So we will continue to be a very vocal champion for free trade, no matter what our relationship with the EU. The UK is, apart from being the fifth largest economy and the only Western economy that spends 0.7% of its GDP on international development aid and 2% of its GDP on defence, it is also a member of all those big clubs and will remain that way. It's a United Nations Security Council permanent member. It's a G7, G20 member, but it's also a leading member of the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth is a group of global economies and countries, but loosely based around relationships with the UK, historic relationships with the UK. But it really comprises of 3 billion of the world's population, 60% of whom are under 60. So in countries like India, for example, in many African countries, in many South Asian countries, there are trade relationships there that have just an enormous capacity to grow, both in bilateral terms, but also in terms of broader economic development terms. And the UK will be very much a part of that and wants to be part of that. When it comes to the relationship with the US is our single biggest trading partner by far, over twice as big as our next partner, which is Germany. So, and I already mentioned that the level of bilateral investment in each other's economies. So yes, of course, the US will be front and center. And if you look at my patch here in Florida, we the UK, export as much to Florida alone as we do the whole of Mexico. So those kind of relationships and developing these new tools we need to go forward to the next generation of our global economy are going to be absolutely critical. And of course, the US is going to be part of that. Whether it has a say on the relationship, on the negotiations, I don't know. I mean, we saw the president was commenting prior to Brexit, make very clear his views. You can make your own mind up as to whether that had an impact on the discussion or not. But what I do know is that our relationship with the US is going to remain one of the most fundamental international relationships we have, for the simple reason that it's not just about trade, it's about foreign policy, it's about security, it's about the kind of ethics and the kind of world order that we want to see about democracy, freedom of speech, cultural interchange, all of that. And so it goes far beyond simple economics.
So far from going to the back of the queue, it's perhaps creating a new line. Thank you.
I wanted to follow up with a quick question on the internal dynamics within the United Kingdom. The fact that if you look at the June 23rd referendum, the people that tended to vote for the referendum tended to live in rural parts. The urban centers voted to remain well within the EU. If there was a second vote, in which you had higher voter turnout. Do you believe the result would have been different?
Well, yeah. So two things I want to highlight here. One is fact with a revote. I think it's very unlikely that it's going to happen. We've seen particular now you would basically betray the 52% right of the British citizens that voted to exit. Also, the economic effects of Brexit so far have not been as first, previewed or anticipated. So that means the government may in fact not even get a different outcome this time. So I think it would be a dangerous option to go into that, but maybe you can say a little bit more, Dave. The other thing is with regards to the younger people, yeah, that is indeed a problem. And again, the Europeans have made clear, right? This is their version. They have said that the United Kingdom cannot have single market access without the freedom of movement of people. And if that refers not only, of course, to the 2.5, 3 million, mostly East Europeans that live already, EU citizens that live already in the UK that have found residence, but it also refers to 1.5 million United Kingdom citizens that live in Spain and in other places, right, across the European Union. It refers also, like you said, to the European Student Exchange Program that has been very vibrant, in which the United Kingdom was a very popular goal to study for a year or so. So I think these are just simple negotiations, not simple, very difficult actually negotiations, but they have to be negotiated on a sector by sector basis.
Yeah, and I think so whether there'll be another referendum, well, no, I don't see it happening. It sounds relatively close on paper, but what it meant in real terms was it was 1 million people more voted for exiting than for remaining, and it wasn't a few thousand, it was 1 million. So, sort of pretending that didn't happen is just not really viable, and there's certainly no intention. In terms of the differences, I mean, I don't think the UK is really different to any other developed economy in those senses. I mean, you see it wherever you look, that the difference between urban and rural populations, between the age demographics and so on. So what I would say, and I was talking about foreign trade being in our DNA, is that diversity is also in our DNA. I mean, London, for example, I mean, it's a global city. We have, we think, over 300 languages spoken regularly in London from 180 different language communities or national communities. London is France's 6th biggest city. So, London is a really, really international city. So, of course, you're going to get different results there to elsewhere. And what Brexit and what our government ministers have been saying Brexit means for us is that actually this is an opportunity for the UK to get more active in engaging at a global level and engaging global communities. We already do it a lot. It's a very, very important part of who we are. The diversity and multicultural aspects of the UK. We're not turning our back on those. I mean, you may have seen some commentary in terms of the rising tensions about demography and about migrant communities and so on. That's something we will certainly refuse to allow to become part of our mainstream debate. We have and always will be a very tolerant, open, multicultural society, and we will remain so. You mentioned the relationship with Scotland earlier, and I didn't answer you. It wasn't on purpose, it was just I forgot. The relationship with Scotland, obviously there was the Scottish independence referendum vote a couple of years ago. The relationship as a result of that vote is sort of hard-coded now in the Edinburgh Agreement. So the prospect of another vote in Scotland for independence, while it can't be ruled out, would need the approval of the Westminster government. In other words, the government of the whole of the United Kingdom, not of the government that just deals with Scotland. And there is absolutely no intention for that to happen. So whilst we can't rule out that the Scottish government might decide it's in their interests, certainly from a UK perspective, it is not. And one of the things that we'll be very careful in doing when we go through the negotiating process is to make sure that all parts of the UK are intimately involved in the process going forward, so they can make sure that their interests are being fully represented.
Absolutely. This has been a wonderful discussion. A lot of issues have been raised, and there's some other issues have also that I believe that if we were to continue the panel discussion, we could be here for hours, especially talking about the limits of free trade and economic convergence and whether or not what's happening in the United Kingdom is is really a blowback from a golden period of free trade that many are wondering has it reached its limits? But we could continue talking for hours. I'd like to thank the panelists, the students, the teachers for coming here today. If you could basically join me in a round of applause and thank you.